The billionaire smirks, daring the janitor to touch the keys. It's just a cruel prank on this broke single dad scrubbing floors for scraps. But as his fingers hit the ivories, a haunting melody erupts, ripping through the room like a storm no one saw coming. What forbidden secret did he unleash that shattered the tycoon's iron facade into tears? Before we begin Elias's incredible journey, if you love stories about hidden talent, second chances, and the power of music to change lives, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now, let's step into Orpheum Hall. The Orpheum Hall shimmered under chandeliers that hung like frozen constellations. The velvet seats rose in tiered curves, crimson and gold, designed to carry even a whisper from the stage to the marble balconies above. At the center of it all, beneath a spotlight not yet turned on, sat a concert grand piano, a Steinway Model D with its lid propped open, strings exposed and waiting like the held breath before a confession. Elias Vance moved across the stage with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to make himself invisible. His blue work overalls were faded at the knees, worn soft from 2 years of kneeling to scrub and polish. Beneath them, a tan short-sleeve work shirt clung to broad shoulders that carried more weight than fabric. His work gloves were tucked into his belt, and in his right hand, a rag that smelled faintly of lemon oil traced careful circles across the piano's lacquered surface, erasing fingerprints and the day's dust. Elias had been working as a janitor at Orpheum Hall for just over 2 years, a job that paid $16.50 an hour and came with health insurance, flexible evening shifts, and the single thing that mattered most: the ability to pick up his 6-year-old daughter, Nora, from Riverside Elementary every afternoon at 3:15 p.m. sharp. He could walk her home, help with homework at the kitchen table, and make dinner, usually spaghetti or grilled cheese, sometimes both if she asked nicely. The work was honest, the hours were predictable, and it was a universe away from the life he'd once built for himself. The one that had crumbled the night a drunk driver ran a red light and took Nora's mother before she ever made it home. Tonight was different. Tonight was the annual Orpheum Foundation Gala, a black-tie fundraising event that transformed the hall into a glittering temple of wealth and influence. By 7 p.m., the city's elite would flood through the brass doors, venture capitalists in Tom Ford tuxedos, philanthropists dripping in diamonds, tech moguls who measured their worth in billions and their time in seconds. Elias had been prepping since noon, polishing the brass railings until they caught light like molten gold, wiping water rings from dressing room mirrors, aligning velvet ropes with obsessive precision. Every surface had to be perfect, because people who wrote 6-figure checks expected perfection, even if they never noticed the hands that delivered it. As Elias leaned over the piano to clean the music stand, he paused, just for a breath, just long enough to let his calloused fingers hover an inch above the keys. The Steinway's polished black surface reflected the stage lights like still water, and Elias felt the old ache stir in his chest, the one he'd taught to sleep for Nora's sake, the one that woke up on nights when she had bad dreams and he played her lullabies on the scuffed upright in their kitchen. He used to perform on stages like this, used to wear tailored suits instead of overalls, used to be introduced as Elias Vance, concert pianist, instead of the guy who mops the green room. Almost finished there, Elias? The voice cut through his reverie like a spotlight snapping on. Elias straightened and turned to see Shaw the Shaw, striding across the stage with the kind of confidence that only came from owning half the city's skyline. At 52, Shaw was impossibly put together. Black tuxedo tailored to perfection, salt and pepper hair swept back, diamond cufflinks catching the light with every gesture. He moved like a man accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around him. "Yes, sir, Mr. Shaw," Elias replied, stepping back from the piano and folding the rag in his hands. Everything should be ready for tonight's performance. Shaw checked his Patek Philippe watch, a reflex. Elias had learned, not because Shaw didn't know the time, but because checking it reminded everyone else that his time was worth more than theirs. Excellent. The maestro should be here within the hour for sound check. Shaw's eyes drifted to the piano, then back to Elias with a glimmer of curiosity. "You spend a lot of time with that Steinway, don't you? I see you polishing it almost every shift." Elias felt heat creep up his neck. "It's a beautiful instrument, sir. Deserves to be treated well." Shaw's eyebrows lifted, amused. "Beautiful instrument. You sound like you know something about pianos." He tilted his head, studying Elias the way someone might study an interesting sculpture at a gallery. "Do you play at all?" Before Elias could answer, before he could deflect with the safe, an invisible response he'd perfected over 2 years, Shaw had already turned toward the growing crowd of early arrivals, filtering into the hall for the pre-gala reception. Board members in evening gowns. Donors with champagne flutes. A tech CEO Elias recognized from magazine covers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Shaw's voice rang out, clear and commanding, a boardroom baritone that could sell anything. The crowd's chatter dimmed, heads turned. Phones emerged from pockets. "I've just discovered something delightful. Our custodial staff member here, Elias, apparently knows his way around a piano. What do you say we have a little pre-show entertainment? Something spontaneous?" A murmur of intrigued laughter rippled through the crowd. Elias saw it in their eyes, the condescending sparkle of people about to be amused by a novelty act. A janitor at a Steinway. Comic relief before the real artistry began. Someone in the third row was already filming. "Mr. Shaw," Elias said quietly, his voice steady despite the knot tightening in his stomach. "I don't think that would be appropriate. I'm here to work, not perform." "Nonsense." Shaw grinned, spreading his arms like a game show host. "It's a gala, Elias. Everyone contributes to the magic. Besides, how often do we get to hear what hidden talents are walking our halls?" He gestured grandly toward the piano bench, his tone light, playful, completely unaware of the weight he was pressing onto Elias's chest. "Come on, play us something. Surprise us." The crowd shifted closer, expectant. Elias recognized a few faces. A philanthropist who'd donated a new wing to the children's hospital, a venture capitalist who'd been profiled in Forbes, a socialite whose charity galas filled the society pages. They watched him the way people watch street performers, entertained, detached, ready to tip if the act was good enough. Elias looked out at them, at their tailored gowns and perfect smiles, their phones raised like weapons. They didn't see him. They saw a punchline, a feel-good anecdote for their next cocktail party. "You'll never believe what happened at the Orpheum Gala. The janitor actually played the piano." It was adorable. And then something shifted. Not anger, not pride, just a quiet, bone-deep exhaustion with pretending. Elias Vance had spent 2 years folding himself small, tucking away the parts of himself that didn't fit a maintenance uniform. He'd done it for Nora, done it to keep the lights on and her lunchbox full. But standing here, with Shaw pointing at him like a circus act and the crowd waiting for him to stumble, Elias realized he had a choice: play along with the joke, or tell the truth the only way he knew how. "What would you like me to play?" Elias asked. His voice was calm, unshaken. Shaw's grin widened. "Surprise us, Elias. Play whatever you think will impress this distinguished crowd." Elias set the rag carefully on the closed fallboard, a small ritual that felt like setting down armor. He crossed to the bench and sat, his body remembering the motion before his mind could catch up back straight, shoulders loose, wrists floating. He adjusted the bench height with precision, the kind of muscle memory that only came from 10,000 hours at a keyboard. His hands hovered over the keys. For just a moment, he let himself remember the practice rooms at the conservatory that smelled like rosin and old wood, the recitals where his name appeared in printed programs, the way his late partner, Sarah, used to sit in the front row and mouth-breathe when he got nervous. The night Nora was born, and he played Brahms's Lullaby in the hospital room while Sarah held their daughter and cried. He closed his eyes. And then Elias Vance began to play Debussy's Clair de Lune. The first notes floated into the hall like light through water, soft, silvery, impossibly delicate, the kind of sound that didn't announce itself but arrived like a secret being shared. Elias's right hand carried the melody, each note shaped with the care of someone sculpting glass, while his left hand murmured beneath it, a quiet pulse that felt like a heartbeat slowing into rest. The laughter died in the crowd's throats. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A woman in a sapphire gown lowered her champagne glass. A tech mogul's phone dipped, forgotten. The marble balconies seemed to lean forward, listening. This was not a janitor stumbling through chopsticks. This was not a novelty act. This was mastery. Elias's fingers moved across the keys with the fluid precision of water finding its path, bringing out every layered nuance of Debussy's Meditation on Moonlight. His left hand didn't just accompany it breathed, rolling through arpeggios that shimmered like ripples on a lake. His pedaling was invisible, each shift so subtle that the harmonies blurred and clarified like memory itself. The crowd stood frozen. This wasn't competence. This was artistry. The kind that required years of training, thousands of hours in practice rooms, a relationship with the piano that went deeper than technique. Every phrase Elias played revealed something. The way he leaned into dissonance before resolving it. The way he let silence hang for a heartbeat longer than expected. The way the melody seemed to ache before it soared. Shaw, standing near the front row, felt something crack open in his chest. He'd meant this as a lark, a charming bit of spontaneity to warm up the donors. But watching Elias really watching him, Shaw saw what he'd missed for 2 years. The way Elias's shoulders carried not just fatigue but the weight of a life lived in 2 keys. The way his hands, calloused from cleaning, moved with the kind of grace that couldn't be faked. Shaw's mind flickered to his mother, a pianist, a woman who'd begged him to stay for one more recital, just one, before the chemo made her hands shake. He'd left for a business deal in Singapore. She died 3 days later. He still had her voicemail saved on his phone. "It's okay, sweetheart. I know you're busy. I'm proud of you." He'd never deleted it. He'd also never listened to it twice. Elias reached the heart of Clair de Lune, the section where the melody climbs and the harmony opens into something transcendent, a window into longing and beauty, and all the things language fails to name. His hands danced, not with flash or showmanship, but with the quiet authority of someone who understood that music wasn't about being heard. It was about being felt. A donor in the 5th row wiped her eyes. A board member sat forward, his mouth slightly open. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." And then, with aching slowness, Elias played the final descent, the melody returning to earth, the harmonies softening into stillness, the last note hanging in the air like a question no one dared answer. Silence. Not the awkward kind, the holy kind. For 5 full seconds, no one moved. No one coughed. No one breathed. The hall held its breath with the piano, as if any sound might shatter what had just been built in the space between them. And then Shaw began to clap. Slowly at first. Deliberately. His hands coming together with the kind of respect reserved for something that had just changed the shape of a room. The rest of the crowd followed, the applause building like a wave, gathering strength, rising into a standing ovation that echoed off the balconies and filled every corner of Orpheum Hall. Elias stood from the bench, his legs unsteady, his face flushed with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He looked out at the crowd, the same people who'd been smirking 2 minutes ago, and saw something different in their eyes now. Not pity, not amusement. Recognition. Shaw stepped onto the stage, his expression transformed. The playful showman was gone. In his place stood a man who looked like he'd just witnessed something he couldn't buy, something that reminded him what it felt like to be moved instead of impressed. "Elias," Shaw said, his voice quieter now, stripped of performance. "That was extraordinary." He paused, searching for words that didn't cheapen what had just happened. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Elias met Shaw's gaze, and for the first time in 2 years, he didn't look away. "I'm a graduate of Juilliard, Mr. Shaw. Class of 2015. I was building a career as a concert pianist before my partner died in an accident. I became a single father to my daughter Nora." His voice was steady, factual, but beneath it ran a current of everything he'd carried alone. "I needed steady income, reliable hours, health insurance, a schedule that let me be home for bedtime stories, so I took this job." The crowd absorbed this in waves, some faces registering shock, others shame, a few nodding with the kind of understanding that only comes from knowing what sacrifice costs. A woman in an ivory gown stood in the right aisle, hands clasped against her mouth. Iris Calder, Shaw's head of arts philanthropy. She'd been a scholarship kid once, 20 years ago, cleaning dorm bathrooms to pay for her degree. She recognized the look in Elias's eyes, the exhaustion of being invisible while holding everything together. Shaw glanced at the piano, then back at Elias, something shifting behind his carefully composed expression. "Why didn't you ever mention your background? We host events here constantly. You could have..." "Could have what?" Elias interrupted gently, not unkindly. "Asked for special treatment? Mr. Shaw, when you're trying to raise a child on $16.50 an hour, you learn very quickly that keeping your job means not asking for things that make you inconvenient." The words landed like stones in still water. Shaw flinched. "Elias," Shaw said, and this time his voice carried the rasp of something raw. Would you be willing to play one more piece? Something of your own choosing?" Elias hesitated, his eyes scanning the crowd, the exit, the rag still sitting on the fallboard. He could leave now, clock out, go home to Nora, who was probably curled up with Mrs. Patterson next door, finishing her math homework, and waiting for Daddy to come home and tell her about his day. But then he thought about the song he'd written for her. The one he played when thunderstorms made her scared. The one built from a melody Sarah used to hum while folding laundry. A melody Elias had caught and shaped and turned into a promise. "You are safe. I am here. We will be okay." "Yes," Elias said quietly. "I'll play one more." He sat back down at the piano, his hands finding the keys like coming home. And then Elias Vance played a song with no name, only a daughter's face in his mind, and the faint echo of Debussy's Moonlight braided into something entirely his own. The melody began simply a lullaby built on 4 notes that repeated, each time gathering a little more light. But beneath those notes lived a story that no one in Orpheum Hall knew. A story of a man who'd stood at the edge of grief and chosen, again and again, to build a life that kept one small girl safe, even if it meant erasing himself in the process. To understand what Elias was playing, you'd need to go back 4 years, to the night everything shattered. The first 4 notes arrived like a whisper between friends. Elias's right hand touched the keys with the kind of gentleness reserved for brushing hair from a sleeping child's forehead. The melody was simple, almost dangerously, so built on an interval that rose and fell like a question asked twice. "Are you awake? Are you safe?" His left hand entered 2 bars later, not as accompaniment but as answer, a soft pulse in the lower register that felt like a heartbeat slowing into rest. He'd adjusted the bench without thinking, a quarter turn of the knob that brought him to the exact height where his forearms floated parallel to the floor, wrists loose, shoulders carrying no tension. It was the posture of someone who'd spent 10,000 hours learning how to disappear into the instrument, to let the music speak without the body getting in the way. His feet found the pedals by instinct, right foot hovering, left foot silent, and when he pressed down, it was with the kind of precision that made the sound bloom rather than blur. This was the mechanics of mastery. Not flashy, not loud, just right. In the 3rd row, a woman in a sapphire gown had her phone raised, recording. Her expression set in that performative interest people wear when they're documenting something for social media, rather than actually experiencing it. But as the melody unfolded, each phrase a little longer than expected, each harmony shifting just before it became predictable, her phone dipped. Slowly, until it rested in her lap, forgotten. Her mouth parted slightly, and she leaned forward as if the music were pulling her by an invisible thread. A donor near the aisle had been whispering to his companion, something about the NASDAQ closing numbers, but the words died mid-sentence. He turned toward the stage, brow furrowed, as if trying to solve a puzzle that had just appeared in the air. A board member in the 5th row, a woman who'd sat through hundreds of performances with the polite detachment of someone checking a cultural obligation off a list, sat forward. Her hands, which had been folded in her lap, gripped the armrests. She wasn't watching Elias's face. She was watching his hands. Because what Elias's hands were doing shouldn't have been possible for someone who mopped floors for a living. His left hand moved in quiet conversation beneath the melody, each note placed with the care of someone arranging stones in a garden. The bass line wasn't just support, it was architecture, giving the melody a foundation that felt both inevitable and surprising. When he shifted into the bridge, his right hand climbed higher on the keyboard, the melody thinning into something almost fragile, and his left hand filled the space below with arpeggios that shimmered like light through leaves. The pedaling was invisible. Most people wouldn't even notice it. But every shift, every half-press that let the harmonies breathe, every release that cleaned the sound before the next chord was timed with the precision of someone who understood that silence was as much a part of music as sound. Elias's mind drifted as his hands remembered. Nora, 3 months ago, standing in the doorway of their bedroom at 2 a.m., clutching her stuffed elephant, eyes wide and wet. "Daddy, I can't sleep. The sirens are too loud." He'd carried her to the kitchen, her small body warm and heavy against his chest, and sat her on the counter next to the upright piano, a beat-up Yamaha he'd bought off Craigslist for $200, one key missing its ivory cap. The soundboard cracked along the lower register. He'd tuned it himself using a borrowed chromatic tuner app, and the perfect pitch he never advertised. The kind of skill that felt both like a gift and a curse because it made every out-of-tune note feel like a pebble in his shoe. "Want the safe song?" he'd asked. Nora had nodded, wiping her nose on her pajama sleeve. So Elias had played this. A melody he'd built from a fragment Sarah used to hum while folding laundry, 4 notes that rose and fell. Simple as breathing, and he'd shaped it into a lullaby that said, You are not alone. The world is loud, but I am louder. I am here. Nora had fallen asleep on the counter, head resting against the wall, and Elias had carried her back to bed and stayed there, sitting on the floor beside her, one hand on her back, until the sun came up and the sirens finally stopped. On stage now, Elias let that memory guide his hands. The melody climbed into the upper register, delicate as spun glass, and he wove in the faintest echo of Debussy's Clair de Lune, just a shadow of the moonlight motif. A three-note phrase that appeared and dissolved like something remembered from a dream. It was the kind of detail only a trained ear would catch. But it didn't matter. The music didn't need to be understood. It needed to be felt. Shaw stood near the front of the hall, arms crossed, his expression shifting from curiosity to something he couldn't name. He'd meant this as entertainment, a palate cleanser, a charming anecdote to share with the donors before the real gala began. But standing here, watching Elias's hands move with the kind of grace that took years to cultivate, Shaw felt something crack open in his chest. The melody was so simple, so unadorned, and yet it ached. Shaw's mind pulled him somewhere he didn't want to go. His mother's music room, 23 years ago. The Steinway baby grand she'd insisted on keeping even when the chemo made her hands shake. The metronome on the top of the piano, ticking like a second heartbeat, the sound he'd grown up with, the rhythm that had marked every dinner, every holiday, every Sunday afternoon. You'll come to the recital, won't you, sweetheart? It's just a small thing. The church on Prospect Street. I'm only playing 2 pieces. What? He'd been 30, building Wellington Industries into something that mattered. A deal in Singapore, time-sensitive, couldn't wait, the kind of opportunity that only came once. He'd kissed her cheek, promised he'd make the next one, and boarded the plane. She died 3 days later, a stroke, sudden and quiet. The last voicemail on his phone was from the morning of the recital. It's okay, sweetheart. I know you're busy. I'm proud of you. He'd never gone to another recital, never sat in an audience and listened to someone pour themselves into a piano, never allowed himself to feel the weight of what he'd traded time for money, presents for success, the last song for a deal he couldn't even remember the details of now. Shaw blinked hard, his jaw tightening. On stage, Elias was playing the final section of the lullaby, the melody descending, softening, each phrase a little quieter than the last, like a light dimming until all that remained was the gentlest glow. His left hand moved in slow, rocking arpeggios that felt like a cradle swaying, and his right hand played the melody so softly it was almost a whisper, the kind of sound you'd make to soothe a child back to sleep. A woman in the audience covered her mouth with both hands. A man beside her wiped his eyes quickly, as if embarrassed to be moved. Iris Calder, standing in the ivory dress near the right aisle, felt her throat tighten. She'd spent 15 years running arts programs, writing grants, sitting through board meetings where community impact meant tax breaks and photo ops. But this was why art mattered. Not because it was polished or professional or marketable, because it told the truth. And the truth was that the man on that stage, in his blue overalls and scuffed boots, was more honest than anyone in this room had been in years. Elias played the final cadence, a chord that resolved not into triumph but into rest, the way a story ends not with fireworks but with a door closing softly and a light left on in the hallway. He held the last note with the sustain pedal, letting it ring and fade and die in its own time, until the sound was so quiet it became indistinguishable from the silence that waited beneath it. And then, nothing. No sound, no movement, no breath. The silence in Orpheum Hall was not the absence of noise. It was a presence thick and holy and impossibly fragile, the kind of silence that felt like the moment between lightning and thunder, when the world holds still and waits to see what will break first. Elias's hands hovered above the keys. He could feel the hall breathing around him, hundreds of people suspended in the space between what they'd expected and what they'd received. He didn't move, didn't stand, didn't look up, because looking up meant seeing their faces, and seeing their faces meant being seen, and being seen was the thing he'd spent 2 years learning to avoid. 5 seconds. 10. And then Shaw's hands came together. Once. Twice. Slowly, deliberately, the sound cutting through the silence like the first crack in a frozen lake. The rest of the audience followed not politely, not dutifully, but with the kind of urgency that comes from needing to do something, with the feeling that's just been placed inside you. The applause built like a wave gathering speed, rising, cresting, until the entire hall was on its feet, clapping and clapping and clapping, the sound echoing off the marble balconies and the chandeliers and the vaulted ceiling that had been designed to carry music but had never carried anything quite like this. Elias stood, his legs unsteady, and the applause hit him like a wall of heat. He flinched, actually flinched, his shoulders drawing in, his head dipping as if the sound were something physical, something he needed to shield himself from. He'd spent 2 years being invisible. 2 years folding himself small. 2 years making sure no one looked too closely at the janitor, with the calloused hands and the oil-stained overalls. And now, standing in front of 400 people who wouldn't stop clapping, Elias Vance realized he'd just made the one mistake he'd promised himself he'd never make. He'd let them see him. The applause kept coming, rolling over Elias in waves that felt both like gratitude and accusation. He stood at the piano bench, hands at his sides, unsure where to look or how to stand, the mechanics of being seen suddenly foreign after 2 years of practiced invisibility. The chandeliers seemed too bright. The faces in the crowd too close. He could see phones still raised, recording, preserving this moment in a way that made it permanent and inescapable. Shaw stepped onto the stage, his expression transformed. The playful showman who'd pointed and grinned was gone. In his place stood someone quieter, more careful, as if he'd just realized he was standing on ground that might crack beneath him if he wasn't gentle. "Elias," Shaw said, his voice cutting through the applause just enough to bring it down to a murmur. He gestured for the crowd to settle, and they obeyed with the reflexive deference people show to men who write the checks. That was, Shaw paused, searching for a word that wouldn't cheapen what had just happened. That was extraordinary. Truly. Elias nodded once, a small, economical gesture that said thank you without opening himself further. Shaw turned to face the audience, then back to Elias, his hands open in a gesture that was part invitation, part apology. "I think I speak for everyone here when I say we'd love to know more about you. Would you be willing to share a few words? About your background? Your story?" The question hung in the air between them. Elias felt the weight of 400 pairs of eyes pressing against him, waiting. He could say no. Could thank them politely, step off the stage, collect his cleaning cart from the storage closet, and disappear into the service hallways where he belonged. Clock out, go home. Kiss Nora goodnight and pretend this had never happened. But Shaw's face carried something Elias hadn't expected to see. Respect. And behind Shaw, the crowd had gone quiet, not the performative quiet of people waiting for entertainment, but the real kind, the kind that made space for truth. Elias cleared his throat. "I'm a graduate of Juilliard," he said, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "Class of 2015. I spent 3 years building a performance career, recitals, competitions, guest appearances with regional orchestras." He paused, choosing his words carefully, aware that every sentence was being recorded, archived, turned into something he couldn't control. 4 years ago, my partner, Sarah, died in an accident. I became a single father to our daughter Nora. She was 2. The murmuring in the audience shifted. Elias could hear it the way the sound changed from polite sympathy to something heavier, more attentive. "I didn't give up music," Elias continued, and he let his gaze sweep across the crowd, meeting eyes deliberately now. "I gave up applause. There's a difference. Music is what I play in our kitchen at 6 a.m., while Nora eats cereal. Applause is this." He gestured to the hall, the chandeliers, the tuxedos. And when you're trying to keep a child fed and safe and loved, you learn very quickly that applause doesn't pay for health insurance. It doesn't pick her up from school at 3:15. It doesn't make sure the light stays on in the hallway when she has nightmares. A board member in the 4th row, a man who'd been leaning back with his arms crossed, sat forward, his posture recalibrating. A woman near the aisle pressed a hand to her chest, her face shifting from sentimental pity to something closer to recognition. Shaw stood very still, his jaw working as if he were trying to swallow something sharp. In the right aisle, the woman in the ivory dress Iris Calder felt her breath catch. She'd been watching Elias since Shaw had first called him to the stage, and now, hearing his story, she saw something she recognized from her own life 20 years ago. The specific exhaustion that came from being brilliant and invisible at the same time. She'd been a scholarship kid once, cleaning dorm bathrooms at 5 a.m., before music theory classes, her hands smelling like bleach while she sight-read Brahms. She knew what it looked like when someone made themselves small so they could survive. She also knew what it cost. Elias's hands gripped the edge of the piano, grounding himself. This job custodial work at Orpheum, it gave me what I needed. Steady hours, benefits, a schedule that bends around bedtime stories. I don't regret it. I'd make the same choice 1,000 times. He looked directly at Shaw. But I also didn't expect to stand here tonight and play for you. So if we're done, I should probably get back to work. The green room still needs. Elias, Shaw interrupted, and his voice carried a softness that surprised even him. Would you? I'm going to ask something, and I want you to know you can absolutely say no. He took a breath, glancing at the audience, then back. Would you be willing to play one more piece? Something of your own choosing. Not because we're asking for a show, but because... Shaw's voice cracked slightly. Because I think we all need to hear it. Elias felt the pull of two opposing forces. The instinct to retreat, to protect what was his, to keep Nora separate from this world of cameras and expectations, and the deeper, older pull to share, to let the music speak the things he couldn't say with words. He scanned the hall, his eyes finding the exit signs glowing red in the dimness. He could still leave. Still choose invisibility. Still be the janitor who showed up tomorrow morning and mopped the floors and never spoke of this again. But then he thought of Nora, curled up next to Mrs. Patterson right now, probably asleep on the couch with her math homework on her chest. And he thought of the song he'd written for her, not the lullaby he'd just played, but the other one, the one he'd been building for 3 years. The one that didn't have a name because some things were too important to name. If he played it here, in front of these people, it would no longer belong only to him. It would be recorded, shared, dissected, turned into content. But maybe it would also do what music was supposed to do. Tell a truth so clearly that no one could pretend they hadn't heard it. All right, Elias said quietly. One more. Shaw's face softened with something like relief. The audience exhaled, settling back into their seats, and the hall went quiet again, waiting, listening, ready. Elias turned back to the piano. He picked up the cleaning rag from where it still sat on the fallboard. His talisman, his boundary, the small reminder of who he was beneath the music, and placed it carefully to the side. He sat down, adjusted the bench with the same precise quarter turn, and let his hands hover over the keys. This piece had no title, no opus number, no dedication printed in a program. It was built from fragments of bedtime routines and grocery store aisles and the specific weight of Nora's head resting against his shoulder during long bus rides home. It was the sound of staying, of choosing anchor over applause, of love that didn't ask for an audience but was willing, just this once, to be witnessed. Elias inhaled slowly, his chest expanding with air and intention. And then he began to play the song he'd written for the daughter who'd taught him what it meant to be brave. The first note was a single point of light in darkness. Elias played it alone, middle C, soft as a breath, and let it hang in the air for 3 full beats before the second note arrived a fifth above it. Then a third, stepping down, then back to the beginning. 4 notes, rising and falling like a question asked in the gentlest possible voice. Are you still there? It was the simplest thing he could have played. No virtuosic runs, no dramatic chords. Just a melody that moved the way a parent's hand moves across a child's back in the dark, steady, patient, promising, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. But woven beneath it, so faint most ears wouldn't catch it, was the shadow of Debussy's Moonlight. The same 3-note motif from Clair de Lune, transformed and softened, appearing like a memory half-remembered. Elias braided it into his own melody, the way Sarah used to braid Nora's hair before bed. 3 strands becoming one, each lending strength to the others. His left hand entered quietly, a rocking figure in the bass that felt like a cradle swaying. The harmony shifted not to minor, but to something in between, the way dusk sits between day and night. Neither one nor the other, but both at once. Nora, 8 months old, screaming in her crib at 2 a.m., her face red and wet with tears. Sarah, pale and exhausted from another round of chemo, slumped against the nursery doorway. I don't know what she needs, Sarah had whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know how to fix it. Elias had lifted Nora from the crib, her small body hot and rigid with distress, and carried her to the living room piano, a rented upright they couldn't afford but kept anyway, because music was the only language that made sense when words failed. He'd sat down with Nora against his chest and played the only thing that came to him, a melody Sarah used to hum while folding laundry, 4 notes that rose and fell like breathing. Nora had gone quiet, not asleep, just listening. Her tiny hand had pressed against his chest, feeling the vibrations of his humming as his fingers found the keys. And Sarah, watching from the doorway, had smiled for the first time in 3 days. On stage now, Elias let the melody climb into the upper register, each phrase reaching a little higher before settling back down. His right hand played the tune with the kind of tenderness that only comes from having played it 1,000 times in kitchens and hospital waiting rooms and on bus rides when Nora couldn't sleep, and the only thing that helped was Daddy humming against the top of her head. Nora, at 4, standing in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, clutching the stuffed elephant she'd named Cloud. "Daddy, can you play the safe song?" "Which one's the safe song, sweetheart?" "The one that makes the scary go away." So Elias had played this, and Nora had climbed onto his lap, her head tucked under his chin, and fallen asleep to the sound of a melody that promised the world might be loud and sharp and unpredictable. But here, in this small circle of sound, she was held. In the 5th row, a donor, a venture capitalist who'd made his fortune in artificial intelligence and hadn't cried in public since his father's funeral, felt his throat tighten. He didn't know why. The melody was simple, almost childishly so. But something in the way it moved, the way it kept returning to the same 4 notes, never abandoning them, always coming home, cracked something open in his chest. He blinked hard, looked down at his hands, and let the tears come quietly. Shaw stood at the edge of the stage, his arms crossed tightly against his chest as if holding something in. He'd meant to stay composed, meant to watch with the professional appreciation of someone who funded the arts but didn't let them touch him. But the melody, God. The melody was pulling him somewhere he'd spent 20 years refusing to go. His mother's music room. The Steinway baby grand with its lid always open, sheet music scattered across the bench. The metronome ticking its steady pulse while she played Chopin and Brahms and Debussy, her hands still graceful even when the chemo made them shake. "Will you come to the recital, James? It's just a small thing. The church on Prospect Street. I'm only playing 2 pieces. He'd been standing in the doorway with his phone in his hand, watching her practice, already half-focused on the emails piling up. Singapore deal, time-sensitive. The kind of opportunity that only came once. "I'll try, Mom. I've got this thing in Singapore, but I'll see if I can move it." She'd smiled the patient, knowing smile of a woman who'd spent 30 years watching her son choose work over everything else. "It's all right, sweetheart. I understand." He'd kissed her cheek, boarded the plane, closed the deal. 3 days later, his sister had called. Stroke. Sudden. The funeral was the following Tuesday. The voicemail was still on his phone, saved in a folder he never opened but couldn't delete. "Good morning, honey. Today's the recital. I know you're busy. I'm proud of you. I love you. I'll play your favorite, the Debussy. Maybe you'll feel it from wherever you are." Shaw's jaw clenched, his vision blurred. On stage, Elias was playing the bridge now, the melody climbing higher, almost breaking into something bright and hopeful before pulling back, returning to the 4-note refrain that anchored everything. It was the sound of staying, of choosing to be present even when the world offered 1,000 reasons to leave. Iris Calder, standing in the aisle in her ivory dress, brought both hands to her mouth, pressing them against her lips as if to keep a sound from escaping. She'd spent 15 years running arts programs, writing grants, sitting in boardrooms where impact meant metrics and tax breaks. But this was why any of it mattered. Not because art was beautiful or impressive or marketable, because it told the truth about what it cost to love someone more than you loved your own dreams. The audience had stopped being an audience. They'd become something else, a congregation, a gathering of witnesses, people who'd come expecting entertainment and found themselves holding something heavier and more precious. The unguarded heart of a man who'd given up everything except the one thing that mattered. A woman in the 3rd row wept openly, not bothering to hide it. A board member removed his glasses and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Even the waitstaff, standing along the back wall with trays of champagne, had gone still, listening. Elias played the final section, the lullaby descending, softening, each phrase quieter than the last. His left hand rocked in gentle arpeggios that felt like the slow sway of holding a child who'd finally stopped fighting sleep. His right hand played the melody so softly it was almost a whisper, the 4 notes appearing one last time like a promise kept. "I'm here. I'm here. I'm still here." The last chord was major, but barely a resolution that felt less like triumph and more like rest, the way a long day ends not with fireworks, but with a door closing gently and a nightlight left on in the hallway. Elias held the sustain pedal down, letting the sound fade in its own time, until the notes dissolved into the silence that had been waiting beneath them all along. He lifted his hands from the keys. The hall held its breath. And then Shaw turned away from the stage sharply, almost violently, and covered his mouth with one hand. His shoulders shook. He stood there for 3 seconds, 5, his back to the audience, trying to compose himself and failing. When he finally turned back around, his eyes were wet, his face stripped of every carefully maintained defense. He reached for the microphone on the podium at the edge of the stage, his hand unsteady. The audience waited. Shaw cleared his throat once, twice. And when he spoke, his voice carried none of its usual polish, just the raw, fractured sound of a man who'd just been forced to remember what he'd lost. "Ladies and gentlemen," Shaw said, and his voice broke on the second word. "Ladies and gentlemen," Shaw said again, steadier this time, though his eyes were still glassy. He gripped the microphone stand as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "I need to say something." The hall waited, silent and attentive in a way that felt different from before, less like an audience and more like a room full of people who'd just witnessed something sacred and were still trying to understand what it meant. Shaw looked down at Elias, who remained seated at the piano, his hands resting in his lap, his expression guarded. "What we just heard," Shaw continued, his voice gaining strength, "was not entertainment. It was not a novelty act. It was the work of a serious artist, a man who sacrificed his career to be a father, because our society doesn't make space for people to be both." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Shaw held up a hand, and the room quieted. "I invited Elias to play tonight as a joke," Shaw said, and the words landed with the weight of confession. "I thought it would be charming, amusing, something to warm up the crowd before the real event." He paused, his jaw working. "I was wrong, and standing here now, I realize that we have been wrong about a lot of things." Elias shifted on the bench, uncomfortable with being the subject of Shaw's revelation, but Shaw pressed on. "The Thornfield Foundation exists to support the arts. We write checks. We fund programs. We put our names on buildings." Shaw's voice carried an edge now, something sharper beneath the emotion. "But we don't fund the artists who mop our floors. We don't make room for the single parents who choose stability over applause because they have no other choice. We celebrate art, but we don't protect the people who make it." A board member in the 4th row sat forward, her expression shifting from sympathetic to calculating. Iris Calder, standing in the aisle, felt her pulse quicken. "Tonight that changes," Shaw said. He turned to face the full audience, his posture straightening into something closer to the commanding presence he usually carried. "Effective immediately, the Thornfield Foundation will establish the Artist Parent Fellowship, a program designed to support working artists who are also caregivers. Childcare stipends, flexible performance schedules, health insurance, subsidized housing if needed. Everything required to let people pursue their art without sacrificing their families." The crowd stirred, some nodding, others exchanging glances that said, "This is PR," or "This is expensive," or "This will never work." Shaw let the murmurs settle before continuing. "And I'm naming Elias Vance as the inaugural recipient." The applause that followed was different from before, not enthusiastic or performative. It was quieter, steadier, an exhale of recognition, the sound of people realizing they were witnessing not a gesture but a commitment. Elias stood slowly, his face unreadable. Shaw extended a hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Elias shook it. The audience applauded again, and camera phones captured the moment. The billionaire in the tailored tuxedo and the janitor in blue overalls, standing together on a stage that had just become something neither of them had expected. Backstage, the air was cooler, quieter. The green room smelled like old velvet, and the faint chemical tang of stage makeup. Shaw closed the door behind them, shutting out the buzz of the gala resuming in the hall. Elias stood near the mirror, his arms crossed, his posture defensive. "Elias," Shaw began, and the smoothness was gone from his voice. He sounded tired. "Human, I need to apologize. What I did out there, calling you up like that, making you perform it, was cruel. I didn't see it at the time, but I do now." Elias studied Shaw's face, looking for the angle, the catch. "You don't need to apologize, Mr. Shaw. You gave me an opportunity." "I made you a punchline," Shaw said flatly. "And then you turned it into something I'll never forget. That doesn't make what I did right." The two men stood in silence for a moment. Elias nodded once, a small acknowledgement that Shaw's apology had been heard, if not fully accepted. About the fellowship, Elias said carefully. I appreciate the offer, but I need to be clear about my terms. Shaw blinked, surprised. Your terms? I'm not interested in being a symbol, Elias said, his voice steady, or a feel-good story you trot out for donors. If I'm doing this, it has to work for Nora. That means no late-night touring during school weeks, no performances that require overnight travel unless it's planned months in advance. Sundays are off limits, that's our day. And I want to teach community piano lessons in the Orpheum basement, free ones, for kids whose parents work the kinds of jobs I work. Shaw listened, his expression shifting from surprise to something like respect. Those are reasonable conditions. They're non-negotiable, Elias corrected. Understood. Shaw extended his hand again. We'll put it in writing. Before Elias could respond, the door opened, and Iris Calder stepped inside. She'd removed her heels and carried them in one hand, her ivory dress slightly wrinkled. She looked between Shaw and Elias, reading the room instantly. I don't mean to interrupt, Iris said, but I wanted to introduce myself properly. Iris Calder, head of arts philanthropy for the foundation. She looked directly at Elias. I heard what you said out there, about choosing anchor over applause. I want you to know I understand. I was a scholarship kid 20 years ago, cleaned dorms to pay tuition. So when Shaw says we're building this fellowship, I want to design it with you, not for you. Elias felt something loosen in his chest. You mean that? I do, Iris said. She pulled a business card from a small clutch and handed it to him. Let's meet this week. Bring your calendar, your needs, your boundaries. We'll build something that doesn't force you to choose. Elias took the card, turning it over in his calloused fingers. For the first time since stepping onto that stage, he allowed himself to believe this might actually be real. One more thing, Iris added, glancing at Shaw. The basement lessons? I love that idea. Let's make it part of the fellowship model. Every artist we support contributes to the community. Not as payment as partnership. Not as payment as partnership. Shaw nodded slowly. I'll approve the budget. Elias looked between them, the billionaire who'd humiliated him, and the woman who'd seen herself in his story, and realized he was standing at a threshold. He could say no, walk away, go back to being invisible and safe, or he could step through and risk everything he'd built to protect Nora. All right, Elias said quietly. Let's try. Before anyone could respond, the door burst open. A young woman in a headset and clipboard, Shaw's PR director, rushed in, breathless and wide-eyed. Mr. Shaw, I'm sorry, but the press is already calling. The Times, NPR, 3 local stations. They all saw the clips online. They want interviews. Tonight, if possible. She turned to Elias. Mr. Vance, I have 5 requests for you specifically. Elias's stomach dropped. His hand instinctively went to his pocket, where his phone was vibrating. He pulled it out and saw the screen. Mrs. Patterson. His neighbor. Watching Nora. Bedtime was in 20 minutes. I have to go, Elias said, already moving toward the door. I'm sorry, but I have to. Go, Shaw said firmly. We'll handle the press. Iris stepped aside, clearing his path. We'll call you tomorrow. Your schedule, remember? Elias nodded, clutching his phone, and pushed through the door into the backstage corridor. Behind him, he could hear the PR director's frantic voice. But Mr. Shaw, they want a statement tonight. Elias didn't hear the rest. He was already running. By Monday morning, the clip had been viewed 4 million times. Elias knew this because Mrs. Patterson had shown him on her tablet while Nora ate cereal at the kitchen table, oblivious. The video had been trimmed down to 90 seconds. Elias in his overalls, Shaw's pointing finger, the first notes of the lullaby, and then a close-up of Shaw turning away with his hand over his mouth. The comments section was a flood of heart emojis and strangers weeping over their keyboards. Elias had closed the tablet and handed it back. I need to get Nora to school. Mrs. Patterson had looked at him like he'd just turned down a lottery ticket. Elias, you're famous. I'm a dad, he'd replied, and we're going to be late. The real victory wasn't the clip or the comments or the fellowship announcement that had been picked up by 3 major news outlets. The real victory was Tuesday morning, walking Nora to Riverside Elementary under a sky the color of old denim, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, her hand warm in his. At the corner, Elias crouched down to zip her jacket. You got everything? Homework? Lunch? Nora nodded, her gap-toothed smile bright. "Did you put a note in?" "Always." He'd written it that morning on a post-it while she brushed her teeth. "You are brave." 3 words he'd been saying to her since she was old enough to understand them. 3 words he needed to hear himself. "Love you, Daddy." "Love you more, sweetheart." He watched her run through the gate, her pigtails flying, and didn't move until she disappeared through the double doors. 4 million views didn't matter. This did. That afternoon, a piano tuner named Marcus arrived at their apartment, a 1-bedroom walk-up with a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people, and the battered Yamaha upright that Elias had bought off Craigslist 3 years ago. Marcus had been sent by Iris Calder, along with a note that read simply, "Consider this an investment." Elias stood in the doorway, arms crossed, while Marcus worked. The tuner moved methodically, turning pins, striking keys, listening with the kind of focus Elias recognized. When Marcus reached the D above middle C, the key that had been missing its ivory cap for as long as Elias had owned the piano, he paused. "I can fix this," Marcus said, pulling a small case from his toolkit. Inside were salvaged ivory caps, sorted by size and age. "Got one here that'll match. Might be a shade lighter, but it'll play true." "How much?" Elias asked. Marcus glanced up. "Already covered. Lady who sent me said you're not allowed to argue." By the time Marcus left, the Yamaha sounded like an instrument again instead of a compromise. Elias sat down and played a scale, each note clear and even, no buzzing or dead spots. Nora, sprawling on the couch with her homework, looked up and grinned. "It sounds pretty now." "It does," Elias agreed. And for the first time in years, he played without wincing. The Orpheum basement smelled like old concrete and possibility. Iris had cleared out a storage room, brought in folding chairs, and found 3 second-hand upright pianos from a shuttered music school. On Thursday afternoon, 12 neighborhood kids showed up for the first free lesson ages 6 to 14, some with parents who worked 2 jobs, others brought by grandmothers who remembered when music programs still existed in public schools. Elias stood in front of them, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been on the gala stage. "Okay," he said. "Who wants to learn how to make a piano sing?" A girl in the front row, maybe 9, raised her hand. "Can you teach us the moon song?" Elias smiled. "We'll get there. First, let's learn how to sit." Iris sat cross-legged on the floor in the back, jeans and a sweater replacing the ivory gown, watching as Elias moved between the kids with patience Elias didn't know he still had. He adjusted posture, shaped hands, spoke in metaphors about waterfalls and breathing, and how the piano was a friend you had to listen to, not a machine you commanded. By the end of the hour, a boy named Marcus, different Marcus, age 7, had played a 5-note melody with both hands. His grandmother cried. Friday brought the rehearsal hall on Prospect Street, a converted warehouse with high ceilings, scuffed floors, and a Steinway grand that had seen better decades. Elias arrived 20 minutes early, hands shaking slightly as he set his music on the stand. He hadn't rehearsed with other musicians in 4 years. Hadn't been judged by peers who would know, instantly, if he'd lost it. The concertmaster arrived next, a woman named Elena, 50s, silver hair pulled into a tight bun, violin case in hand. She looked at Elias with the polite skepticism of someone who'd seen viral clips before and knew they didn't always translate to real skill. "You're the janitor," she said, not unkindly, just stating fact. "I'm the pianist," Elias corrected gently. Elena smiled slightly. "We'll see." They were running through Brahms' The Piano Quintet in F minor along with a string quartet Iris had assembled. Elias's part was dense, technically demanding, the kind of piece that required not just accuracy but conversation between the instruments. He started cautiously, feeling his way back into the muscle memory, but by the second page, something unlocked. His hands remembered. The strings entered, and Elias adjusted instinctively, listening, responding, shaping his phrases to fit the architecture the others were building. Elena, playing first violin, glanced at him during the development section, a moment where the piano and violin traded a motif back and forth like a question neither could answer alone. Elias met her eyes, nodded slightly, and they leaned into it together. When they finished the movement, Elena lowered her violin. "You're not a janitor," she said. "You're a pianist who cleans floors." "For now," Elias replied. Elena nodded, and the skepticism was gone. "Let's run it again, faster this time." Shaw stood in the doorway of the basement lesson room the following Tuesday, unnoticed. He'd told himself he was there for a board walkthrough, checking on facility usage, but the truth was simpler. He wanted to hear. Inside, Elias was teaching a girl how to play a C major scale with her left hand, while her right played the melody to Twinkle, Twinkle. It was painstaking, repetitive work. But Elias's voice carried the same patience Shaw had heard in the lullaby. "You're doing great. Try again. Listen to how it sounds when the notes are even." Shaw didn't go in, didn't interrupt. Just listened from the hallway for 5 minutes before walking away, something loosening in his chest that he didn't have a name for. The invitation arrived by courier on Wednesday, cream-colored envelope, embossed return address from the Thornfield concert series. Inside, a formal request for Elias to perform a solo recital on the second Saturday of next month. Prime slot, full house, the kind of opportunity that could relaunch a career. Elias read it twice, standing in his apartment kitchen while Nora watched cartoons in the next room. Iris called 10 minutes later. "Did you get it?" "I did." "And?" Elias looked at the calendar on the fridge, covered in Nora's drawings and school reminders. "That's a Saturday. Nora has a soccer game in the morning." "We can schedule around it," Iris said. "Elias, this is a big deal." "But," she paused, "you should know there's been some pushback. A board member is calling the fellowship optics over substance, saying we're funding sentimentality instead of serious artistry. If you do this concert and it goes well, it shuts that down." Elias closed his eyes. "And if it doesn't go well?" "Then we fight harder," Iris said simply. "Your call." Elias looked at the invitation again. The Saturday concert, the board resistance, the chance to prove he was more than a viral moment, and the knowledge that saying yes meant putting himself and Nora back under a spotlight that didn't care about bedtime or sticky notes or the cost of being seen. "I'll think about it," Elias said. But the envelope stayed on the counter, glowing like a dare. The boardroom on the 19th floor of the Wellington Tower smelled like leather and old money. Shaw sat at the head of the long mahogany table, hands folded in front of him, while 10 board members reviewed the fellowship proposal Iris had distributed. Most faces were neutral. One was not. Martin Caldwell, founder of Caldwell Capital and the foundation's largest single donor, set down the document with the kind of precision that signaled a prepared attack. "This is sentiment-driven PR," he said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being right. "We're a serious arts institution, not a social service agency." Shaw kept his expression neutral. "The fellowship supports working artists. That's our mission." "Our mission," Caldwell countered, "is to fund excellence, not to subsidize janitors because they went viral." He leaned back, arms crossed. "You're asking us to commit $2.3 million over 3 years for a program built around one feel-good story. What happens when the headlines fade and we're left with overhead costs and no measurable outcomes?" Around the table, several board members shifted uncomfortably. A woman near the window, Patricia Lim, a tech executive, looked down at her notes. "The outcomes are measurable," Iris said from her seat near the door. "We've projected stipend distribution, childcare slots, performance hours." "Projected," Caldwell interrupted. "Not proven." "Shaw, you announced this program in front of cameras without board approval. That was a mistake. I'm calling for a formal vote before we release another dollar." He glanced around the table. "And I'm recommending we table the fellowship until we can commission an independent review." Shaw felt the room tipping. Caldwell had the votes if he wanted them. 3 board members owed their seats to his donations. When would this vote take place? Caldwell smiled thinly. 2 weeks. The second Saturday of next month. We're already scheduled to meet that morning for budget review. The same day as Elias's concert. Shaw saw it immediately. Caldwell was forcing a choice. Cancel the concert and lose momentum, or proceed and risk the board pulling funding before Elias even stepped on stage. "I'll take it under advisement," Shaw said carefully. Caldwell stood, straightening his cuffs. "Good. Let's make sure we're funding art, not headlines." At Riverside Elementary's playground, Nora hung upside down from the monkey bars, her pigtails brushing the mulch below. Elias stood nearby, hands in his pockets, waiting for the after-school bell. He'd come early today. His rehearsal had been cut short by a journalist who'd somehow gotten the rehearsal hall's phone number and demanded an interview about the tragedy that shaped his music. Elias had hung up. "Daddy!" Nora dropped from the bars and ran over, backpack bouncing. "Guess what?" Mrs. Alvarez said we're doing a family music project for assembly. We get to play a song that means something to our family. Her eyes were bright, hopeful. Can I play the safe song? The one you made for me? Elias's chest tightened. The lullaby. The one he'd played at the gala. The one that now had 6 million views and a comment section full of strangers dissecting what it meant. Sweetheart, that's a special song. Just for us. Nora's face fell. But that's why I want to play it. Because it's ours. She tugged on his hand. You said music is for sharing. You shared it with all those people. Can't I share it with my class? Elias crouched down to her level, searching for words that would make sense to a 6-year-old. How could he explain that sharing the lullaby at the gala had felt like stepping into traffic, and now the world was asking him to do it again, this time through his daughter? Let me think about it, okay? He said softly. We'll figure something out. Okay, Nora said, but her voice carried the weight of disappointment she was too young to hide. That evening, Iris sat in her office with a laptop, and 3 years' worth of grant data spread across her desk. Shaw had called after the board meeting, his voice tight. Caldwell's going to kill this. He's framing it as vanity philanthropy. Iris had responded the only way she knew how, with numbers. She built a spreadsheet that tracked outcomes from similar programs at other institutions, artist retention rates, community engagement metrics, long-term career, sustainability for parent artists. Then she drafted a memo that reframed the fellowship not as charity but as infrastructure. The scaffolding that let talent survive long enough to thrive. At 11 p.m., she emailed it to Shaw with a subject line that read, "Call his bluff." Shaw replied at 11:03, "He'll still force the vote." Iris typed back, "Let him. We'll win." She didn't add the part she wasn't sure of, that they'd only win if Elias's concert proved he was worth the fight. Friday's rehearsal was supposed to be a full run-through. Instead, Elias spent the first 20 minutes fending off a reporter from the Chronicle who'd somehow talked her way past the building security. She stood in the doorway with a recorder and a sympathetic smile that felt like a trap. "Mr. Vance, our readers want to know more about your journey, the loss of your partner, how grief shaped your art." She tilted her head, performatively gentle. "Can you talk about the night she died? What you felt when you realized you'd have to raise Nora alone?" Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. "No. It's a powerful story," the reporter pressed. "People are inspired by—" "I'm not interested in inspiring anyone," Elias said, his voice flat. "My partner's death is not content. If you'll excuse me, I have work to do." He closed the door in her face, hands shaking. Elena, waiting at her music stand, looked at him with quiet understanding. "They did the same thing to me after my daughter died, wanted me to perform grief for them." She lifted her violin. "The music is enough. Don't give them more." Elias nodded, but his focus was fractured. The rehearsal was rough, missed cues, uneven dynamics, a passage in the third movement where his hands simply forgot what came next. When they finished, Elena said nothing, but her silence felt like doubt. Shaw sat in his office late Sunday night, staring at 2 paths laid out in front of him like a choose-your-own-adventure he couldn't win. Path 1. Pull Elias from the concert. Delay the fellowship vote. Negotiate quietly with Caldwell. Offer him something he wanted in exchange for his support. It was the smart play, the political play, the kind of compromise Shaw had built his career on. Path 2. Let Elias perform. Let the board vote happen the same morning. Risk everything on the chance that one concert could prove Caldwell wrong. His phone buzzed. A text from Iris. "He's good enough. Trust that." Shaw closed his eyes. The problem wasn't whether Elias was good enough. The problem was whether Shaw was brave enough to bet on something that couldn't be measured in returns or tax breaks or buildings with his name on them. He thought about his mother, the recital he'd missed, the voicemail he still couldn't delete, the metronome that used to tick in her practice room like a second heartbeat. He picked up his phone and called Iris. "Tell Elias the concert is still on, and tell him the board votes that morning. He deserves to know what's at stake." "He'll pull out," Iris warned. "Then that's his choice," Shaw said. "But I'm not making it for him." The call came Tuesday morning while Elias was making Nora's lunch. Iris's voice was steady but serious. "The board is voting on the fellowship funding the same day as your concert. 10 a.m. Vote. 7 p.m. Performance." Elias set down the peanut butter jar. "What happens if they vote no?" Then we fight to get it reinstated. But Elias, I'm not going to lie to you. If they kill the funding before you perform, it sends a message that you weren't worth the investment. And if I pull out of the concert? Then Caldwell wins by default. Elias looked at the calendar on the fridge. Nora's school assembly was Friday. Her soccer game was Saturday morning. The concert was Saturday night. The board vote was Saturday morning. Everything converging into a single weekend where every choice felt like a betrayal of something he'd promised to protect. I need to talk to Nora, Elias said. Elias, I'll call you back. He hung up and stared at the sticky note he'd written for Nora's lunchbox. You are brave. The question was whether he believed it about himself. Saturday, 10:07 a.m. The Wellington Tower, 19th floor. The boardroom was quieter than it had been 2 weeks ago. Caldwell sat at his usual position, arms crossed, while Iris stood at the presentation screen with a clicker in her hand and 3 years of data behind her. The Artist Parent Fellowship isn't charity, Iris said, advancing to the next slide. It's infrastructure. These projections show artist retention rates increase by 340% when childcare and flexible scheduling are provided. Revenue from performances by supported artists across comparable programs nationally exceeds administrative costs within 18 months. Caldwell leaned back. Projections aren't guarantees. They're better than assumptions, Iris countered. And the assumption that artists should choose between their work and their families is costing us talent we can't afford to lose. Patricia Lim, the tech executive, raised her hand. What about accountability? How do we measure success? Iris clicked to a slide titled Outcomes Framework. Quarterly reviews, performance hours logged, community engagement tracked, childcare utilization rates. We're not asking you to fund a feeling. We're asking you to fund a system. Caldwell checked his watch. Where's Shaw? As if on cue, the door opened. Shaw entered, not in his usual tailored suit but in a dark sweater and slacks, looking like a man who'd slept poorly and decided to stop pretending otherwise. Sorry I'm late, Shaw said. He didn't sit. Instead, he stood near the window, hands in his pockets. I want to say something before we vote. Saturday, 7:03 p.m., Orpheum Hall main stage. The stage lights were warm, almost gold. Elias sat at the Steinway, hands resting in his lap, looking out at a full house, 800 seats filled with people who'd come because of a viral video, or Iris's marketing, or simple curiosity. In the front row, Nora sat in a blue dress with white flowers embroidered on the collar, her legs swinging, too short to reach the floor. Mrs. Patterson sat beside her, one hand resting gently on Nora's shoulder. Elias had chosen his program carefully, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata to open, grounding the evening in something familiar and reverent. Then Arvo Pärt's Furalina, a contemporary piece so spare it was almost skeletal, just two voices in conversation, each note carrying the weight of everything unsaid. And finally, his lullaby, the one he'd written for Nora, the one that now belonged to more people than he'd ever intended. He began the Beethoven. The opening triplets rolled through the hall like distant thunder, and the melody above them moved with the deliberate slowness of grief walking through a room. Elias let each note breathe. Let the silence between phrases become part of the architecture. This was music that didn't ask for applause, it asked for listening. Saturday, 10:14 a.m. boardroom. My mother was a pianist, Shaw said, his voice quieter than usual. The board members shifted, unused to hearing Shaw speak about anything personal. She played Chopin, Debussy, Brahms. She taught me that music wasn't decoration, it was truth in a language that couldn't lie. Caldwell frowned. Shaw, what does this have to do with? She died 23 years ago, Shaw continued, cutting him off. She'd asked me to come to a recital. A small thing, nothing important, but I had a deal in Singapore. Time sensitive. I told her I'd make the next one. He paused, his jaw working. There wasn't a next one. She had a stroke 3 days later. The room was silent. I didn't fund this fellowship because it's good PR, Shaw said. I funded it because I know what it costs to arrive too late, and I refuse to let this foundation be the reason someone else misses the song that matters. He looked directly at Caldwell. You're right that we need to fund excellence, but excellence doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in people who need time and space and support to keep making it. That's what this fellowship does, so vote however you want. But I'm standing behind it. Shaw sat down. Caldwell stared at him, his expression unreadable. Patricia Lim spoke first. I move to approve the fellowship funding. 3 years full pilot cohort. Seconded, said another board member. Caldwell said nothing. All in favor? Iris asked, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. 7 hands went up, then an 8th, then a 9th. Caldwell was the last. He raised his hand slowly, his expression somewhere between resignation and respect. Motion passes, Iris said, and something in her chest released. Saturday, 7:38 p.m. Orpheum Hall. Elias finished the last 2 notes hanging in the air like a question neither voice could answer, and let the silence settle before moving into the lullaby. This arrangement was different from the one he'd played at the gala. Simpler, more intimate. Just the melody and the rocking bass line. No ornamentation, no Debussy echo. Just the truth of what he'd written for his daughter when the world was too loud and she needed to know someone was listening. In the front row, Nora leaned forward, her mouth moving silently, mouthing the melody she knew by heart. Elias played the first verse, 4 phrases that rose and fell like breathing. Then the second, slightly varied, the harmony shifting to something between major and minor, neither hopeful nor sad, but present. And then, in the final verse, something unexpected happened. Someone in the audience hummed along, quietly at first. A single voice in the balcony, barely audible. Then another joined from the left side. Then a third. By the time Elias reached the last 8 bars, a dozen voices were humming the melody back to him, not intrusively but as offering proof that the song had become something larger than its origin. Elias felt his throat tighten. He played the final cadence a resolution into rest, not triumph, and held the last chord until it dissolved into the silence and the humming faded with it. The applause came like a tide, warm and unrelenting. Nora stood in the front row, clapping with her whole body, her face bright with pride. Elias looked at her and remembered why he'd made every choice that had led here. Not for the stage, not for recognition, but for the mornings where he could walk her to school and the nights where he could tuck her in and whisper, "You are brave." The applause grew louder, a standing ovation. And then, from the wings, a figure emerged, David Chen, the evening's scheduled headliner, a celebrated pianist who'd sold out Carnegie Hall 3 times. He walked to the edge of the stage, gestured for quiet, and spoke into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Chen said, smiling, "I was supposed to close tonight, but I think we all know who should take the encore." He turned to Elias. "It's yours if you want it." Elias looked at Chen, then at Nora, then at the audience still on their feet. The world was offering him permission to stay not just for tonight, but for all the nights to come. The question was whether he could accept it without losing what mattered most. He stood, nodded to Chen, and spoke quietly into the mic. "Thank you. I'll play one more." "For my daughter." The hall erupted again, and Elias sat back down, his hands finding the keys like coming home. Saturday, 9:47 p.m. Backstage, green room. The hallway smelled like champagne and borrowed adrenaline. Elias walked toward the green room, Nora's hand in his, her head resting against his side. She'd stayed awake through the whole concert, and now exhaustion was winning. He opened the door and stopped. On the table sat a frame, simple black wood, museum-quality glass. Inside was a photograph from the gala. Elias at the piano in his blue overalls, the cleaning rag folded beside him, his hands hovering above the keys, his face caught in the moment before the first note. The caption below, handwritten in ink, read, "Power is the ability to say, 'We see you, keep going.'" Elias stared at it, something breaking open in his chest. Behind him, Shaw's voice came quietly from the doorway. "Thought you might want a reminder." Elias turned, Nora still tucked against him. "Thank you." Shaw nodded once. "The vote passed this morning. The fellowship is funded. You're not alone in this anymore." Elias looked down at Nora, who'd fallen asleep standing up, and then at the photo, and then at Shaw, the man who'd started as an instigator and become something closer to an ally. "Neither are you," Elias said. And for the first time in 23 years, Shaw believed it. Monday morning, Shaw's study, Upper West Side. The study faced east, so the morning light came in clean and direct, illuminating the shelves lined with books Shaw had purchased but rarely read, and awards he'd received for philanthropy that felt, in hindsight, more like transactions than transformations. He stood in front of the empty space on the wall beside his desk, the spot where a Rothko print had hung for 15 years, expensive and appropriate and completely forgettable. He lifted the framed photograph. Elias at the piano in his overalls, hands poised, the cleaning rag beside him like a talisman. Shaw had paid a small fortune to have it museum mounted, the kind of framing usually reserved for art worth 6 figures. But the photo wasn't valuable because of its market price. It was valuable because it reminded Shaw of the moment he'd stopped performing power and started using it. He hung the frame carefully, adjusting it until it sat level. Then he stepped back and looked at it for a long time, the way his mother used to look at sheet music before she played, reading something deeper than the notes. Power means making room, not taking space. Shaw sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, and began drafting an email to the board. A proposal to expand the fellowship to 10 additional artists by year 2. Not because the metrics demanded it, because the people did. Wednesday afternoon, Riverside Recording Studio, Brooklyn. The studio was small, tucked into a converted warehouse that smelled like coffee and old vinyl. Elias sat at the upright in the corner, not a Steinway, but a well-maintained Yamaha that reminded him of the one in his kitchen, and listened to the playback through the engineer's headphones. "That's the one," the engineer said. "A woman named Tasha with silver rings on every finger. 3rd take. You can hear the room breathing with you." Elias nodded. The track was the lullaby. Recorded simply, just piano. No overdubs, no reverb to smooth the edges. He wanted it to sound the way it did in his kitchen at 6 a.m., unpolished, honest, close enough to feel like someone was sitting beside you. The EP was called Nora's Sky, 6 tracks, 3 originals, 3 arrangements of pieces he used to play for Sarah. Iris had connected him with an independent label that specialized in ambient and modern classical, and they'd offered a deal that respected his terms. No touring during school weeks, no press that required discussing Sarah's death, full creative control. "When does it release?" Elias asked. 2 weeks, Tasha said. "And I already sent the lullaby to WNYC. They want to feature it during their bedtime hour segment." Elias felt something catch in his chest. The bedtime hour. The slot parents listened to while tucking in their kids. The same slot he used to turn on while holding Nora when she couldn't sleep, and the apartment felt too quiet without Sarah's breathing in the next room. "That's good," he said quietly. "That's really good." Thursday evening, Orpheum basement. The waiting list had grown to 43 names. Iris stood in the doorway of the basement lesson room, watching Elias move between 3 kids at 3 different pianos, adjusting posture, shaping hands, answering the same question in 3 different ways because each child heard differently. Behind him, 2 other teaching artists worked with their own students, a violinist named Marcus who was raising his nephew, and a cellist named Amara whose daughter had cerebral palsy and came to lessons in a wheelchair that Iris had made sure the building could accommodate. They were the first fellows, the pilot cohort. 3 artists who'd been told for years that parenting and artistry couldn't coexist, now proving otherwise in a basement that smelled like old concrete and sounded like the future being tuned 1 note at a time. A girl, maybe 10, named Sadie, played a scale with her left hand while her right held the melody to the lullaby she'd heard on the radio. "Mr. Vance, can you teach me how to make it sound like you?" Elias crouched beside her bench. "You don't want to sound like me. You want to sound like you. But I can teach you how to listen. And then your hands will know what to do." Iris watched him work and thought about the board meeting, Caldwell's skepticism, Shaw's speech about arriving too late. She thought about the spreadsheet she'd built, and the data that had won the vote. But mostly she thought about this. A room full of kids who might not have access to music if someone hadn't decided that infrastructure mattered more than headlines. She pulled out her phone and texted Shaw. "You should see this." He replied 2 minutes later. "Send me a photo." She did. Just the wide-shot 3 pianos, 3 teachers, 12 kids, all of them leaning into the work of learning how to make something beautiful from scratch. Shaw's response came as a single word: more. Iris smiled, already planning it. Sunday morning, Elias's apartment. Nora sat at the Yamaha in the kitchen, her feet dangling above the pedals, practicing the melody for her school assembly. She'd chosen a simplified version of the lullaby, just the right hand, no bass line yet, and she played it with the careful concentration of someone who knew this song mattered. Elias stood at the stove, flipping pancakes, watching her out of the corner of his eye. The apartment smelled like butter and maple syrup, and the particular kind of peace that only arrived on Sundays, when the world agreed to slow down and let people breathe. "How's it sound?" Nora asked, finishing the phrase. Perfect, Elias said, and he meant it. Not because the notes were flawless, she'd stumbled twice and her rhythm was still uneven, but because she was playing music, not just notes. She was listening, shaping, making the melody her own. Can you play it with me? Nora asked. Elias turned off the stove, wiped his hands on a towel, and sat beside her on the bench. Okay, you take the melody. I'll play the harmony underneath. They played together, Nora's small hands on the white keys, Elias's larger ones filling in the spaces below, the two parts braiding together the way Sarah used to braid Nora's hair. Elias felt the familiar ache of her absence, but it wasn't sharp anymore. It was softer now, worn smooth by time and the presence of the daughter they'd made together. When they finished, Nora looked up at him. Do you think Mama would like it? Elias's throat tightened. I think she'd love it. I think she'd be so proud of you. Nora leaned against him, and they sat there for a moment. The morning light coming through the window, the piano humming faintly with the resonance of the last chord. Pancakes are ready, Elias said. Can we eat them at the piano? Just this once. They ate breakfast side by side on the bench, syrup-sticky fingers and laughter, the Yamaha holding space for them the way it always had anchor and stage, memory and promise, the place where both rooms stayed lit. Sunday evening outside the Orpheum, dusk. The marquee glowed softly against the deepening blue of the sky. It read, Elias Vance, Artist in Residence. Community lessons, Thursdays, 4-6 p.m. Next performance, Oct. 14. Elias and Nora walked past it hand in hand, her backpack bouncing with the leftover sheet music from her assembly rehearsal. The October air was cool, carrying the smell of roasted chestnuts from a vendor on the corner and the distant hum of traffic settling into evening. Nora looked up at the marquee. That's you, Daddy. It is, Elias said. Are you scared? He thought about it. Sometimes, but not right now. They walked in silence for a moment, their footsteps sinking, the city moving around them with its usual indifferent rhythm. Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear, faint against the light pollution but present if you knew where to look. Nora squeezed his hand. Daddy? Yeah, sweetheart? Thank you for playing the safe song, even when it was scary. Elias stopped walking, crouched down to her level, and looked into her eyes, Sarah's eyes clear and trusting and impossibly brave. You know what the safe song is really about? Nora shook her head. It's about staying, even when it's hard, even when you're scared. It's about showing up for the people you love and letting them know you're not going anywhere. Like you stayed for me? Exactly like that. Nora smiled, the gap-toothed grin that could undo him every time, and wrapped her arms around his neck. I'm glad you stayed. Me too, Elias whispered. They stood, and Elias took her hand again. Ahead, the Orpheum's doors glowed warm and golden, and beyond them, the rehearsal hall where tomorrow he'd teach scales and arpeggios, and how to let the piano sing. Behind them, their apartment with the newly tuned Yamaha and the sticky notes on the fridge and the couch where they'd curl up later to read before bed. 2 rooms, stage and home, both lit, both his. The moon appeared above the buildings, pale and nearly full, casting silver across the marquee and the sidewalk and the girl walking beside him. Moonlight on polished keys, hands at rest. The lullaby humming in the distance, or maybe just in memory, braided so tightly into the fabric of their lives that it had become indistinguishable from breathing. Ready to go home? Elias asked. Nora looked up at him, her hand warm in his, her eyes bright with the particular fearlessness of children who've been loved well. Always, she said. And together, they walked toward the lights. Elias's story reminds us that the most extraordinary people are often hidden in plain sight. If this touched you, honor it by sharing. Send this to someone who's grinding through hard times while holding on to their dreams. And click the next video on your screen to discover another incredible true story about second chances and the courage to be seen. Your comment below could inspire someone today. Tell us, what's a dream you've put on hold? Don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you in the next story.